hit the other thing.
Webinar is now streaming live on Facebook.
Is it? Oh, does it say that? Are we?
Yeah, we got a box.
We're
We're live.
Are we sure we're live?
No,
I see that
I'm
it
sure.
says that.
Dave, can you see if we're live?
We could just keep
Not yet.
dancing. Well, David just sent me a message. I think he may be watching this stream right now.
Okay, I don't think it cross-posted. I got a little bit nervous. It might be cross-posting now.
Okay, but
right,
are we definitely on XR Denver at this point?
Let's launch. We have a recording. If we're not live, we can post the video later. Let's go.
You're right. Okay, cool. So hello, everyone. Welcome to Heading for Eco-Fascism and What to Do About It. And thank you for joining us in this endeavor of a training. So just really briefly to kind of go over why we're doing this. In response to the coronavirus pandemic, a lot of people have started expressing sentiments that have kind of an eco-fascist lens to it in varying degrees. And so some of us here in Extinction Rebellion Denver decided to come together and form a training around this to help people realize what eco-fascism is, so you can name it and avoid it and call it out when you see it. So that said, we're going to go over eco-fascism, what it is, a little bit of the history. We're going to talk about why we care about it as individuals and why Extinction Rebellion cares about it. And we're also going to talk about what to do about it. So this will be about an hour. And after the hour, we're going to have question and answers. So if we say something and you have a question about it, just go ahead and type it into the live stream on Facebook, and we will hopefully get a chance to answer your questions after everything. With that said, it seems a good time to introduce ourselves. So my name is Jessie. I am an organizer here with Extinction Rebellion Denver. I've been around with XR for a little bit over a year, and I focus on regenerative culture and our music working group. And that's me.
Hi, I'm Reed. I've been organizing with XR for coming up on 9 months. I think I saw the talk for the first time last May. And I tend to bounce around from need to need within the organization and do a little bit of everything. And I'm really excited to be presenting this training with Jessie today.
And we do also have a third person on this call, our tech wizard, if our tech wizard would like to introduce himself.
Hi, I'm Dave. I'm just trying to learn new stuff about Facebook and Facebook Live and cross-posting, and somewhat successful in that endeavor. Bye.
All right, thank you, Dave. So before we dive into any of this, I just want to make it really clear that we are not here to blame or shame anyone. And we are here to openly challenge ourselves and the toxic system we live in, the toxic system that is in fact the problem, not people. So.
All right, so let yourself settle on that image for a second, because when I saw it for the first time, it was really shocking. In part because I think that most people don't realize that eco-fascists are, in general, very sincere in their environmentalism. Next slide. So the first question is, what is eco-fascism anyway? Because you see a lot of name calling floating around, with rhetoric about COVID-19 right now, and it's very important that we have a basis in the history and the definition and how that manifests in our world today. Eco-fascism is fascism as a response to the reality of the ecological crisis, which includes the racism and nativism and reactionary violence that's a part of fascism in general. It's a core group of people who are both environmentalists and white supremacists and advocate solutions that include fewer humans on the planet and the reduction of humans leading to the reduction of different cultures and ethnicities. So in short, eco-fascists see the looming ecological collapse as an opportunity to reorder society along their preferred lines. These commonly include ideas such as certain members of the population being expendable, like elders or folks who are disabled or have chronic illnesses, poor people, migrants, refugees. So in short, the very same people who you see bearing the brunt of COVID-19 right now. There's also a narrative that we deserve whatever happens to us, despite the fact that Black, Indigenous, and people of color make up the majority of those below the poverty line and are at the highest risk of dying of infectious disease. So for example, again, with COVID-19, in Chicago, you can see that Black people make up around 72% of the coronavirus deaths, despite only making up 29% of the population. And that means that about 52% of those testing positive are Black. This comes into a core concept of environmental racism, which is the manifestation of structural and institutional racism, in a sense that people of color are more likely to live near polluters or waste sites, including Superfund sites, and to breathe polluted air that generally results in a lot of related chronic health conditions, such as heart disease and asthma, and to live in housing areas that are vulnerable to climate change-related flooding and other disasters. And so the narrative that we deserve whatever happens to us effectively means that our most vulnerable populations are put at increased risk and bear the brunt of that more than anyone else. Jesse, next slide.
Okay, so this is going to be a little bit more on the history side. Eco-fascism has its roots in Nazi Germany. This kind of came out of Romanticism that was in response to the Enlightenment. A lot of folks in Germany did not like the intense focus on the concept of universalism, suggesting that all people are the same, that we're all equal, and the focus on, cities being a sign of progress and all these things. So Romanticism in Germany in the late 19th century kind of started to manifest itself in like a back to the land movement, which is a benign idea at first glance, but it kind of got twisted, and not kind of, it 100% got twisted by people starting to suggest that this idea of blood and soil is a real thing. And to explain what I mean by blood and soil, it's the idea that your blood is inherently connected to your ethnic identity, and that your ethnic identity is inherently connected to your soil, the soil that makes the place that you were born, that the soil leads to the culture. And so, in the 19th century and going into the 20th century in Germany, there started to be phrasing like Germany for Germans. And that's a different way of pushing forward this blood and soil rhetoric. Something else that's really important to think about right now, and that I just learned actually a few days ago, that eco-fascism was one of the main reasons that Nazis justified the genocide of Jews. And they did that through tying Jews to like the liberal bourgeoisie, the materialistic culture. They were the symbol of modernity. And for the folks who were part of this Back to the Land movement and this romanticism, that they viewed industrialization and modernity as the beginning of the decline for the German race. So it became necessary in their minds, to protect their land, which then for them by extension to protect their ethnic identity, to literally murder all of the Jews that were murdered in the Holocaust. And another important part of that is that Jews were viewed as, Jews in Germany were viewed as a people without a land. People started pushing this rhetoric that, Jews lived all over the world and they didn't have a homeland, which, a lot of us are probably aware that the Israel and Palestine conflict is that's a huge thing. I'm not gonna, say too much about that, but this was also an issue back in the 19th and 20th century. And it was used as a justification, again, for murdering hundreds of millions of Jews. Let's see what else I want to say. So just kind of really briefly to hit on Thomas Malthus. He was an 18th century economist and demographer in England. And he popularized the idea that one day population would grow at an exponentially faster rate than our food production, or than resources in general, but he focused on food production. And he suggested that when this happened, there would just be mass starvation, there would be war, there would be famine, it would be chaos, and just people would die. Hundreds of thousands of people would die. And this idea, although it's been proved wrong time and time again, with advances in technology that has allowed us to produce far more food than we actually have need for, people still believe this. So if you think about connecting this Malthusian rhetoric, or this Malthusian ideology, I should say, with the blood and soil and the Nazi Germany rhetoric, you get a really, really scary situation where genocide does become necessary. And it, like, I'm saying that in a, like, I don't like saying that, but for people who think that way, that's the logical end, is that genocide is what has to happen. So that's just a little bit of the history. And let's see. So these are some examples of eco-fascism today. The Unabomber is a little older than the Christchurch and El Paso shooters, as those were both last year. I know for a fact that both the Christchurch and El Paso shooters listed environmental concern as part of their justification for murdering and injuring the people who they did in their respective acts of violence. Yeah, so it's really important to just understand that these incidents are not just one out of nowhere. They're all connected to this grander issue of eco-fascism. They are tied very inherently to white supremacy, and that the hope of folks like this, like Brenton Tarrance and Patrick Wood, Crusius and Ted Kaczynski, is to reduce the amount of humans, which will then reduce the amount of different cultures and different ethnicities that we have. And like Reed said a little earlier, it's using the ecological crisis to readjust society in their own preferred way. And yeah, we're going to look at some examples related to COVID-19 that Reed is going to talk about.
Yeah, so we've seen a lot of examples of eco-fascist or borderline eco-fascist rhetoric around COVID-19. Things like "we are the problem," or the idea of COVID-19 is an awakening, or "we're the virus." Very big thank you to the people on Twitter that have entirely turned "we are the problem" and "we're the virus" into satire. You are doing amazing work. Thank you so much. So, but with that moment of levity, I think one of the questions that naturally comes up here is, Reed, this isn't eco-fascist. This is probably just people observing things and then saying the first thing that comes into their head. That doesn't acknowledge that it's a systemic problem, not an individual person problem. And so I think this comes back to the concept of intent versus impact. The intent may not be to promote eco-fascist rhetoric, but the impact is definitely that we normalize saying that humans are the problem, that the death of humans is the solution. To quote the Indigenous Anarchist Federation, "To say humans should disappear is a gateway justification for some very unbenign terror. It's not that they're eco-fascist, it's that they identify with the precursors necessary to allow fascism. A single drop does not make a river, but when enough fall, the river starts to flow." And so I want you to keep that in mind when you're looking at these examples, mostly from Twitter, but also we've seen similar things on Facebook and on Reddit and other social media platforms. Just because it is not openly saying that we should let our most vulnerable populations die, it is identifying with the precursors for that logic. And that's a really scary thing. Next slide, Jesse, we're going to look at some more explicit examples. So these are examples of overtly eco-fascist media. So we have "Save Bees, Not Refugees," if you're having trouble reading that font, which understandable. And then we've also got a "Defend Nature, Blood and Soil." And so what we see here is these very slickly designed images that promote both environmentalism and the death of vulnerable and minority populations. When you're looking for some telltale signs that maybe this is eco-fascist rhetoric coming up, think about some of the things that you generally associate with fascist narrative, such as overt nativism and racism, use of weaponry or death in the imagery. For example, we see here the skulls, and then behind the skull on the blood and soil, also some gas mask imagery. And so you can look for this concept of primitivism with those typical images, in addition to things like Norse runes or that type of imagery that we see with some very classic neo-Nazi movements. And again, I want to emphasize that we're looking at this phrase, blood and soil, which, as Jesse was talking about, is the core of eco-fascist logic. We've seen this revived recently in Charlottesville in 2018. We have seen this become a prevalent slogan again, and I think that considering the eco-fascist implications as well as the more broad fascist implications is very important. So we're going to move on to our next slide, and that's actually a very quick break slide. Amazing. That's actually a very quick break for our sanity, because we've just covered a lot of really heavy and intense stuff. So take a minute, take a deep breath, stretch, check in with your body about how it's made you feel. If you need to fidget a little bit right now to let go of some of that stress. This is some really scary stuff, and we're learning so that we can take care of each other. So I'm going to take a moment just to breathe and stretch, and then we're going to launch into our section that's a little bit more about why we care and where do we go from here. Jesse, you ready to go? All right, looks like either I am momentarily frozen or Jesse is momentarily frozen. So we'll just hang out for another. All right, Jesse's back. We'll launch back in just a second.
Sorry about that. I'm not sure what just happened. Okay.
It's technology. Nobody knows.
You're not wrong. Okay. And it wouldn't be, this is, let's start. Oh. We're just gonna have to skip through some slides. Okay, cool. So we're back.
All right, perfect.
All right. So the big question, why do we care? Sure, we could acknowledge eco-fascism is a thing, but why do we care? Why should we care? Understanding is a really important part of not unknowingly doing harm to other people. You know, if we don't take the time to think about these things and then to talk about them with one another, we will likely continue to cause harm to people without even knowing about it, which just because you don't know that you're causing harm doesn't make it okay. You're still causing harm. And for me, I think about this in terms of regenerative culture. We want to have a culture that is healthy and that's not toxic, and white supremacy and eco-fascism are so toxic. Yeah, eco-fascism and white supremacy hurt white people too. Obviously, a lot of the rhetoric that we've been seeing about COVID-19 has been more focused on BIPOC individuals, which is Black, Indigenous, people of color, as well as obviously Chinese folks, with people like Donald Trump saying this is the Chinese virus. But these things also hurt white people. How, you might be wondering? Well, white supremacy culture, which is the culture that all of us who live in the Western world have been brought up in, white supremacy culture includes things like misogyny and patriarchy, and even capitalism is, you know, part of this with, if you think about individualism and how that interplays with capitalism. So these things hurt white people. And there's a resource that we'll hit on at the end of this talk called Dismantling Racism. There's a wonderful list of all of the elements of white supremacy culture. But they hurt white people too. And then the big one, eco-fascism is a manifestation of white supremacy, which I think we've talked about this already a little bit. in terms of like how eco-fascism was used as the justification for the Holocaust, and how eco-fascism is coming out today with, we can particularly focus on the shooting at the Walmart in El Paso last summer. If y'all are not super great with geography, El Paso, Texas borders Juarez in Mexico. And there's lots of folks who are people of color and who are immigrants there. If you can hear howling, I apologize. There's people howling outside. Anyway, okay, cool. We're gonna step on to the next slide. Actually, no, I'm sorry. We're coming back to this one. So if folks wanna, this might be kind of strange, but if you're watching on Facebook and you'd like to put some stuff in the comment stream on Facebook, responding to like, what do you think of when we say the phrase white supremacy? What do you think of when we say the phrase eco-fascism? And obviously, we've been talking about these, but we just want to check in to see like how folks are engaging in meeting these concepts right now. And maybe once we get to the Q&A, Dave can bring some of those comments out. But I'm just gonna give like a minute, maybe 30 seconds for folks to type some stuff into that comment stream. What do you think about when we say the phrase white supremacy?
I think you can even do something as simple as rate between 1 and 5 your experience with talking about white supremacy culture and your comfort level doing so, where 1 is like, I've never done this before. These are new words. I don't know what's going on here. And 5 is, I have taught workshops about this. I'm an expert here. Just throw us a 1 to 5. We'll see what's up.
Cool. Thank you for that, Reed. Okay. And we're gonna just hop on to that next one because it kind of feeds in nicely.
Yeah.
So we just wanted to make sure that during this whole training, we're pausing and giving y'all some time to like, be like, I can think for a moment, I can breathe for a moment. So that's why we're having these little regenerative breaks in the training. So, reminder that we are all participating in this culture that is founded upon white supremacy, not out of our own desire to participate, but because this is what we've been born into, and it's a coerced relationship that we have to engage with each other in these ways that are completely founded upon white supremacy. So, saying that differently, again, just to really reiterate, we're not blaming or shaming anyone. Knowledge is a tool, and the more that we can understand what eco-fascism and white supremacy are, the better equipped we will be to fight back against it and live a better life and not cause harm to people. So just want to maybe ask folks right now if you'd like to pause and breathe. And I'm stealing this from Reed, but it's breathe in what the situation is and breathe out what the situation needs. And just take yourself through that a couple times.
So you can breathe in and just accept all of the negative things and difficult things that may be coming up. They're part of what it is right now, and you can absorb that and embrace it. And then breathe out what you want the situation to become and what you want to bring to the situation. Just take a couple nice deep rounds of breaths there, and then we'll launch into our why does XR care bit of this talk. All right, so coming back to our information part of our talk, because I think that engaging with those emotions is a really important part of this presentation too. The big question is, why does XR care? And I think that comes down to the fourth demand that exists within most XR local groups in the United States. And I'm going to acknowledge the second elephant in the room, which is that there are some groups that do not have this demand, nor do they want it. And I want to tell you tonight why you in your local group should want this demand. So to read off what we have on the slide here, we demand a just transition that prioritizes the most vulnerable people and Indigenous sovereignty, establishes reparations and remediation led by and for Black people, Indigenous people, people of color, and poor communities for years of environmental justice, establishes legal rights for ecosystems to thrive and regenerate in perpetuity, and repairs the effects of ongoing ecocide to prevent extinction of human and all species in order to maintain a livable, just planet for all. In a sense, the fourth demand is really self-explanatory. We have an absolutely horrifying history of hundreds of years of slavery and genocide of Indigenous peoples in this country. And to add to that, Indigenous peoples and people of color generally are disproportionately affected by the global climate crisis. See also our legacy of environmental racism and the ways in which other crises affect these people in disproportionate ways. Environmentalists inherit a troubling history of colonialism, racism, and exclusion within their movements, not just outside of them. See, for example, the history of racism and eugenics that Jesse talked about as part of the roots of eco-fascism, and that are frankly part of the roots of the field of ecology that a lot of our work is based on. Environmental discrimination has been a part of civil rights law, and continued concern about the equity of that legislation, including propositions for a Green New Deal, have been criticized for how they tokenize or exclude communities of color. And so this is an ongoing battle. This is a legacy that we inherit as environmentalists, and it's on us to create not only more inclusive movements, but more inclusive futures. And the fourth demand articulates that in a really important way. So Jesse has a little bit more on why XR specifically cares.
That I do. So if you're familiar with Extinction Rebellion, which I'm just gonna assume most of you are, since this is streaming on our Facebook page, but you likely know that not only do we have demands, we have principles. So we went and we looked at the 10 principles that make up Extinction Rebellion and picked some that we felt were really highly related to this topic of eco-fascism, white supremacy, and why it's actually embedded within Extinction Rebellion that our movement cares about this. So I'm going to go through these kind of one by one. One of our principles is that we need a regenerative culture, which I kind of mentioned a little bit about this earlier. But what this means is a culture that is healthy, a culture that is resilient, and a culture that is adaptable. Something that I also think is really important to consider with just the word regenerate or regeneration is that it involves the death and rebirth of something. And so in the context of this discussion, we could think about how I really liked what Reed mentioned with we as environmentalists, we've inherited this legacy and we must do something about it. So if you take that and think about regeneration as a concept, we have to let go, and maybe in some ways, and this might be a bit dramatic, but we have to destroy and just completely get rid of that rhetoric, of that mentality that allows for genocide to be a suggestion to solve environmental problems, so that in our healthy, not toxic culture, we can thrive together. I really like regenerative culture, so I I might nerd out on that a little bit. So then we also have, we openly challenge ourselves in this toxic system. So, you know, we need to step outside of what we're comfortable with. For a lot of environmentalists in the United States in particular, where a lot of environmental groups are predominantly white, it's far more comfortable to not talk about these things and to just continue on unknowingly causing harm, as I was talking about earlier. But in order for us to be successful in what we're trying to do and to work to create this regenerative culture, we have to challenge the toxic foundations of the whole system. And then we welcome everyone and every part of everyone. This might be the most straightforward one in terms of its relation to this talk, but we can't say we welcome everyone if we're then suggesting genocide as a solution to environmental degradation. That's the complete opposite of this principle. So another way to think about principle number 6 is that we want to create safe and accessible spaces for people. And it's certainly not safe if we're spewing eco-fascist sentiments, if we're continuing on with these ideas that maybe seem benign, but have a history of being a part of, say, like Nazi Germany in this case. So, yes. We avoid blaming and shaming. Obviously, that was one that we started the talk off with. But just to reiterate, it's not any one individual's fault. If you have ever like thought like, oh, you know, there's just too many people, like that doesn't mean you're a bad person. You probably were reaching what was a logical end for you with the information that you were given. But, you know, once presented with new information that suggests to you that overpopulation is not the problem, that people are not the problem, but rather capitalism and white supremacy are the problem, then it is on you to change. But that aside, we're not blaming and shaming anyone. It's the system that teaches you to think these things. And then the last one, we are a nonviolent network. So the way this principle is written, it's mostly supposed to be in regard to the way we carry out actions. But I can get really also nerdy about nonviolence, particularly with communication and how we relate to one another. And if you think about eco-fascism as an ideology, that shit is violent as fuck. It's a violent idea that leads to violent ends. All of the lives that have been murdered in the name of that ideology. Yeah, so that's why
last
XR
year,
cares.
if you can't find anything else to reference, we've had
Right.
lives lost, many lives lost to eco-fascism in the last year.
Yes, and now I'm going to
Next
pass it back to Reed.
Corona is the cure, humans are the disease. I'm going to be very honest with you, and when I saw this image, my first response was shock. Because yeah, that happened. And when I say that happened, I mean a white supremacist group hijacked the XR logo and put these posters up. But the issue here is that there's too many people outside the movement that can't distinguish this messaging from genuine XR posters or stickers or flyers. It has been very clearly stated that the group calling itself XR East Midlands is not affiliated with the actual Extinction Rebellion group in the area, nor Extinction Rebellion UK, nor are they supported in these positions in any way. But because there is such a legacy of this in environmental movements, it is very easy to co-opt that messaging in a believable way. And if there's no other reason for XR to care, it's because we can be mistaken for these people really easily if we're not on top of our messaging and our actual morals behind this. It's not just the image, it's how we're talking about the cause. And so I'd urge everyone to keep this picture in mind and the fact that it was compelling and convincing to many people who may never have heard follow-up about what really happened. All right, Jess.
All right, so now I would say the more possibly uplifting stuff. What can we do, right? We know this is a problem. We know a little bit about what it is. What can you do? So understand discomfort is at the root of all growth and learning. If you are uncomfortable right now, we do apologize, but at the same time, a friend of mine used to tell me comfort kills dreams. So you gotta be uncomfortable. Everyone will make mistakes, and those mistakes, let's see, I can't see what the slide says, but it will lead to opportunities for learning. So I kind of was hitting on this with the principles slide, but you know, if you have, or if you're thinking about or back right now to like, oh, I said this one time, or I shared one of those pictures of like the air is more clear now, like from the slide that Reed looked at of examples of eco-fascist rhetoric, like now is not the time to beat yourself up about it and to just pity yourself and be like, oh God, I'm such a bad person. Now is the time to take what we are presenting to you and think about it, just sit with it. And once you've sat with it for a little bit, to be like, okay, cool, what am I gonna do now? Now that I know, how will this change me? Yeah, that's all we can ask, is to grow and to learn and to change.
Other suggestions for what you can do include slow it down and encourage people to think deeper about what they're saying. So take a moment and listen and say, what's the meaning behind this? What are people actually trying to imply with this language? And then to have the courage to challenge with compassion, knowing that you've had the opportunity to inspect some things that you may have learned and maybe reconsidering, and that if you approach these schisms with a lot of empathy, people do listen, and people are open to hearing new information. And so I'd encourage you to bring it up in conversations with people that are close to you in your life, if you hear that meaning behind what they're saying. And the other ask, of course, is that you deepen your understanding of racism and oppression. And this is a thing that all of us will continue to do throughout our lives. But after this presentation, we're going to post some additional resources for you to take a look at and do some of that reading and work in your own lives, which I think Jesse has on a slide coming up.
Yep, so just to briefly name them, put the titles in front of you. These are some resources that we certainly used when making this talk, and especially with that first one, Dismantling Racism, that's been a part of XR for quite a while longer now at this point. But yeah, so Dismantling Racism, a workbook for social groups, maybe it's social change groups. And then Eco-Fascism, How Benign Ideas Go Wrong, which is about a 30-minute YouTube video based upon, or adapted from an essay that was written in like the 70s, 80s, or 90s. And then we have a podcast, The Armed Lifeboat, Eco-Fascism and the Roots of Conservation in America. And as Reed mentioned, we will post links for these things if you would like to learn further. And there's certainly far more resources than just these, but we thought that these would be 3 good places to direct folks after this talk.
All right, So Dave, I think, is going to hop on and read us off any questions that we've gotten for the talk. And if you have more questions, please feel free to pop into the live stream now. Hi, Dave.
Hi, thanks. That was great.
Thanks.
There's been a ton of like comments and questions and things. So I've tried to keep as best track as possible. I want to start off with an apology if I mess up a name or if I miss something. It's a little bit awkward kind of being this middle person instead of people just asking their own questions, but I guess that's...
It helps us a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, we love you, Dave.
If you see recurrent, if you see recurrent themes, please feel free to like bring those ones up first so that maybe we can answer a couple questions in one go if there's something that seems to be coming up again and again.
I was going to just kind of go in chronological order, at least to start.
Yeah, go for it. Thanks.
So Dean was asking, do you really consider the Unabomber right terrorism?
So I think this comes into a discussion of how we distinguish eco-terrorism versus eco-fascism. I do not specifically know a lot about the Unabomber, and I would direct that question to Jesse maybe. But I think that there's a discussion to be had about the way tactics are described and the way ideology manifests, because there can be some fuzzy areas on these terms. Jesse, do you have more?
I mean, I unfortunately don't really have that much more just because I'm interpreting this as a yes or a no question. I mean, do I interpret or do I view the Unabomber as a right-wing terrorist? And for me, the answer is yes, I do. Yeah, I don't have much further on that though.
Okay, let's move on to the next. There's a bunch here. So Susie pointed out, and some of these have like discussion. I'll try to bring those in. So Susie pointed out there needs to be a distinction made between these efforts by white supremacists and the efforts made by indigenous peoples to protect their own land and water. Sometimes it gets violent, but that doesn't mean they're fascists. And Tim replied, think Susie has an interesting point. I've heard Native Americans talk about their blood, aka their lives, being bound to the land, soil, but also water, if not even more the later.
Thanks for bringing that up. That's a really nuanced take on this, and I'm glad to hear that. I think that a lot of what we're talking about comes back to this understanding of white supremacy culture on stolen lands. And that I would put that at the core of what we're discussing today as two white people presenting this. Bessie, you want to add on that?
Yeah, and I mean, this is something that like, as I started learning about eco-fascism, and particularly when I was learning about the blood and soil rhetoric, which is very highly disturbing to me, I did think about this, you know, and how we do need to distinguish between white supremacist blood and soil and how, you know, certain Native groups do have this connection to the land. And the only thing I would really add on to what Reed said is like, you know, I've never read anything in history about Indigenous groups proposing or going through with a mass genocide of people that was based upon their connection to the land. And I think the distinguishing point that I would make there, you know, because I think the person who had the question mentioned like violence. While I do really love nonviolence, I recognize that like nonviolence is not a dogma, it's a tactic. And I think it's different if like violence happens when you're protecting yourself or your land versus violence where you're like trying to kill hundreds of thousands of people, or if you're not even trying to kill that many people, but if your intention is to diminish ethnic diversity or cultural diversity. Yeah, so that's how I would answer that question.
Cool, thanks. We had an earlier question. I didn't even write this one down, but I'm realizing now that we don't actually have any slide material up. Do you want to stop sharing? Someone said our faces are like really small. Maybe they're on a phone or something.
Yeah, let's see if I can stop share.
There we go. Okay, cool. I'll keep moving
You didn't
down.
want to look at my beautiful slide that I worked so hard on? Oh, I know, my face is prettier, it's fine.
So now we're getting more into when you ask the questions about white supremacy and you gave the number scale. And so people were answering those questions. And David answered, white supremacy hurts white people because we lose a big part of our humanity.
Love that. We'll have that on a slide next time.
And Alexa had a comment, how do you suggest we talk to people in our lives who express eco-fascist talking points, views unintentionally? That is to say, people who have adopted this rhetoric but don't necessarily adhere to the ideology.
I think it's coming back again to that idea that I mentioned with the quote from the Indigenous Anarchists Federation, which is that talking about how this becomes a precursor for elements of fascism, and also acknowledging that you know these people and that you can, until proven otherwise, assume that they were trying to do good things for you and for other people by bringing this up, that their intentions were good. You can walk in with that assumption, even if you don't walk out with it. And I think that can lead to a lot of compassion and meaningful discussion by giving people that benefit of the doubt to start.
I would also add, like, and I think this is something that certainly that Reed and I were speaking about as we were developing this, but like there's layers to eco-fascist rhetoric, which I think we kind of highlighted with the media examples about COVID-19 versus like those straight up eco-fascist pictures that Reed had up with stuff like Save Bees, Not Refugees. But I just say this because, you know, I think it depends like how you answer or how you respond to someone who is saying things that have an eco-fascist lean or tendency to it. I mean, if it's someone who's willing to have like a whole ass conversation with you, then you can kind of like jump in. For me, like this is kind of been like a longer term thing, but I've always like detested the overpopulation rhetoric. I never necessarily thought about it in regard to eco-fascism until like the last couple of months, but I just always like, no, I just don't like this. And so I'd like pick fights with people about it. But that for me, I would suggest, I'm very confrontational. I would suggest maybe to start with talking about overpopulation, and there's a lot of great resources that debunk why overpopulation is not the problem. The other thing I would say is there's a method of questioning called like the Socratic method. And like if someone says something that you are like, oh, like that sounds not good, instead of like immediately jumping in and telling them like, hey, I don't like what you just said because I think you're wrong and that's eco-fascist. Like you could maybe ask like for further clarification about what they did mean, which I think Reed was getting to on one of those like what you can do slides.
Yeah, for sure. So if someone posts like, it's really cool that we're seeing better air quality and we should do that always, make sure that you like keep them on that. Okay, but the thing that's making the air quality better is fewer cars, not people with chronic illness and our elders dying. Like, let's identify the thing that is improving this. If the thing that's improving this is slowing down consumption a little bit and reassessing our values and our connections as community, then say that. And so interrogating like what the underlying message is a big part of this.
Thanks. So the next group of responses I got were the number answers, but can you, before I share those, can you remind us what the question was?
Yeah, so my question was, can you rate like on a scale of 1 to 5 of One being, I have never heard the phrase white supremacy culture ever in my life. This is new ground. And 5 being, I've taught workshops on this. And like what people's level of familiarity was coming into this. Just that we have a little bit of an idea of who we've talked to today, I guess.
So we got 7 responses to that, and 2
Mhm.
responded with a 3, 2 people responded 3 to 4, and 3 people replied with a 4. And
Great
I
job,
stopped
guys.
taking replies as we started this conversation. So there might be more at this point for those.
Cool.
Sounds like we had a great audience. That's great.
Here's another one on eco-fascism definition. This one's coming from Salamander. Eco-fascism for me is an attempt to preserve this destructive culture and economy at any cost.
That's also a good quote. Another slideshow quote for next time.
Love you, Salamander.
Yes, that too.
And now some of these have replies in them too, and I'll try to include those, including this next one. So Justin asks, how deep does this run? Are there statistics that show this is a significant amount of people seriously embracing this? What are we up against? And Kevin did reply, Justin, Michael Moore just distributed a new film about the climate crisis on YouTube yesterday, and he echoes these themes.
Hell yeah, watch the documentary.
As far as the statistics part, like I haven't seen like statistics that say like these amount of violent attacks or murders are eco-fascist or like anything as like clear cut as that. But when we put out the additional resource page, again, that YouTube video, Eco-Fascism, How Benign Ideas Can Go Wrong, it's based upon an essay that is analyzing eco-fascism. It's a scholarly essay. So that to me gives it credibility. And then as far as, I mentioned this earlier, the Christchurch and the El Paso shooters both listed environmental concerns in their manifestos or whatnot as part of their justification for what they were doing. So it's not like a nice and neat statistic per se, but I think there's certainly evidence that proves that eco-fascism is a defining part of the logic of these mass acts of violence.
Yeah, and I would add on to that the podcast that we're going to put up a link to goes into how a lot of the same ideas that resulted in the founding of the United States National Park System were hailed by Adolf Hitler as foundational in the whole blood and soil philosophy in that discussion. So in terms of ideology, it goes really deep. It's everywhere. In terms of how's it showing up in the modern day in people, that becomes a lot stickier of a question because I encourage you to think about terms and conditions on social media sites. And this sounds like kind of a weird place to start, but there are things you can and can't say on certain sites. And so when I went down this really massive rabbit hole of what does eco-fascist rhetoric look like on the internet, a lot of these pictures came up through search engines off of sites, not just 4chan, but people who have gotten too extreme for 4chan and are on 8chan or 16chan. I'm not shitting you, these sites exist. And so it's really hard to know who exists outside what echo chambers for us and for other people, because it's not like you can survey all of Facebook and say, hey, who's an eco-fascist? That'll go great. So
some people
it's
are proud
hard
about it.
to know. But historically, it's everywhere.
Cool. This next comment was from the XR Justice site.
Okay.
I'm thinking about what's happened to XR Portland, where there are 3 or 4 chapters now because of contingent of and this is their opinion. This is not the official opinion of XR Denver or anything here. Because of eco-fascists with funding who were paid to work for the chapter back at its founding, came back out of nowhere with funding and decided that they were going to start a new chapter that dropped the 4th demand and tied itself to XR America. It's a really complicated
Oh, boy.
situation, and they convinced almost everyone who consistently attended meetings that conversations about race, class, and sexual disparities were just a distraction. Everyone followed the eco-fascists because they did not have any understanding of those things. They just knew that carbon emissions are bad. Eco-fascism eats liberalism for breakfast. Thank you for having this talk. It's really important.
Thank you for that last
Yeah.
sentence. Eco-fascism eats liberals for breakfast.
Liberalism.
Liberalism. Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, I think
Go ahead.
part of my takeaway here is that when Jesse told me there were multiple XR Portland chapters that were going back and forth over the fourth demand, what I told Jesse is that that's the most Portland thing I've ever heard. I'm very sorry, people for Portland, but you live in a city with a major history with the KKK, and that's where your Antifa groups come from. And the fact that this is just not discussed as part of the history of such a white city means that the fact that there's an eco-fascist faction up there surprises me not at all. That's just par for the course.
Yeah. The only thing I think that I really want to say in response to this, and just full transparency, Reed and I talked about whether we wanted to bring up Extinction Rebellion America, which maybe obviously all of you in XR Justice are aware of Extinction Rebellion America. Maybe some of you who are not in that group are unaware, but yeah, fuck it, we're here, so we might as well talk about it. The only thing really that I do want to say is like in terms of benign ideas, I think this is where a really firm grasp on what eco-fascism is becomes really important, right? So, if you're having a conversation with someone, or if you're looking at like these 3 demand Extinction Rebellion Portland groups, or at a 4 demand Extinction Rebellion America, and you're like, what's the difference? Or like, what's the big deal? So what? They don't have a 4th demand. That's where, like, if you know the history, 1, of this colonized imperialist country that we live in, and 2, if you understand the rhetoric and the logic of eco-fascism, you can see how like you might be being manipulated to consent to being a part of a group that you don't actually agree with. If that makes sense. And I think I'm saying that interpreting that eco-fascism eats liberalism for breakfast. We can get conned into being a part of these groups or these movements that have these completely ulterior motives, and maybe you didn't even know. And this is also where it becomes important to remember that we don't blame and shame people, right? So if you're out there and you were part of XR3D or XR America and you want to come back to us, we'll welcome you back. We really will. But yeah, I think I'm gonna stop rambling.
Yeah, I think my summary for that is it's not just about inclusive movements, it's about inclusive futures.
I'll add to this one. This is also why XR Justice was started, right? Because we wanted a counterweight to anyone within the XR movement who was not based on justice, on social justice. So that's why that group exists, and I'm really happy that everybody in XR Denver is like on board, and we don't have 4 different XRs running around. and hopefully long term we'll get back to just having one, because it doesn't make any sense to have multiple XRs. I mean, it's just confusing. But I'll back off now. I'm just the tech guy for this one. Next one's from Tim. Seems like eco-fascism is, at least in a way, basically fascism, far right, authoritarian, etc., with ecology concerns just as a justification for fascism. And there's a bunch of replies to this one. Alexa, right, like eco concerns as a means to ends. And then Kevin, it's often used by people on the right, but it crosses the axis. Sierra Club has a history of anti-immigration and population control, although Sierra has now tossed those people. And then Dave pointed out, different Dave, Sierra used to
I have two things. One, so if some of you are familiar with like the Democratic Socialists of America, one of their like committees is the Eco-Socialist group, right? And some people might say, well, isn't ecology just a part of, you know, socialism? It's like, well, yeah, but like if you can have a more refined focus and definition if we say eco-fascism, right? And in this talk, we're looking at how, I think one of the comments said that ecology is used as a justification for fascism. And oh, I had another thing. I don't remember. Maybe it'll come back if you want to tap in, Reed.
Yeah, I think I want to reiterate that this isn't just oh, I can use environmentalism to justify my thing. Eco-fascists are, by and large, genuine environmentalists. They just see the solution as getting rid of the people that they already want to get rid of as their solution to any ecological crisis. So it's not necessarily genuine versus non-genuine environmentalists. It's recognizing the ways in which our connection to climate change and to land weaves in with our duty to social justice. And I say duty here because I think that as white people, we carry a massive legacy. It's on us to do good things.
I remember the thing that I was thinking about.
Hell yeah.
So yeah, this happens a lot. So in preparing for this talk, I came across really disgusting rhetoric surrounding racial ecology, which is like, you know, an idea that this isn't a full definition, but just, you know, what I'm thinking about right now, that there's these natural hierarchies within nature. And so we must mimic these hierarchies as humans. And so there's a natural hierarchy of humans. So it's like the eco-fascism is like 100%, yeah, part of white supremacy as an ideology. And then, actually, yeah, that's all I was going to say. Just racial ecology is that.
Jumping off of that, social Darwinism is a lie. That our understanding, I'm an ecologist, and our understanding of how evolution and ecology work today very strongly includes the concept that in many animal societies, struggle is often replaced by cooperation, and that the most fit communities are the ones that work together. And the last time I tried to explain this to Jesse, I started rambling about mold spores, and I will spare you, but but I think the takeaway here is that you can twist any scientific knowledge to your own ends, and that a lot of science has a really ugly history. And I'd encourage anyone who's talking about any type of evolution to have an understanding that Darwin was a racist and Malthus was just an economist, guys. He was just an economist. Don't listen to him.
Okay, so for this next one, I'm going to put my mask on, which will become, there'll be a reason for this as I read it. And it has replies to it too, so I'll get through a bunch of stuff. So Dean says, being violent does not make you a fascist. Antifa will often fight fascists. And then we have some replies to that. Tim says, agreed, Dean. Violence is bigger than fascism. Any politics, any whatever susceptible to it. Anti-apartheid in South Africa was, in one aspect, fighting state police. One aspect of Black struggle was nonviolent. Other was armed pushback. And Susie replied, right, Tim, we can talk about our blood and land being tied together, but dare I say, it's a more legit claim. Also, native tribes don't leave their own territory with the express purpose of wiping out people different from them.
Yeah, I mean, full agree. Just because you're violent doesn't make you a fascist. Absolutely. There's a great video on YouTube called The Philosophy of Antifa. Really dives into that idea. and it does a really good job of saying it's a false equivalency, to say that like, oh, well, Antifa's violent, so they're fascists. Like, wait a minute, Antifa literally means anti-fascist. Like, you can't just, the anti-fascists aren't fascists. False equivalency, completely illegitimate argument. And I don't know, maybe this question was put in before, but when someone brought up that like nuanced perspective earlier about like the indigenous folks being violent to protect, you know, their land, I tried to like answer that. So, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'd throw out that Zapatista movements and Black Panther movements are incredibly effective and just movements that I really admire. And so nonviolence is not always the answer for all people. And those movements have done good work. That said, still fuck eco-fascists. But
Okay, so that was the end of the questions and commentaries, at least up until the point where I started to read them to you.
yeah.
Hold on, but at the same point, we're now like an hour and 15 minutes in. So I don't know if you want me to try to interpret more, or if we want to just like answer anything that remains on Facebook itself.
I'd say call it personally. I think that we've done quite a bit today, and that I think that the resources that we really want to put up for people are going to answer some of these questions. And if there's enough interest, I can't speak for Jesse, but I'd be down to do some kind of follow-up Q&A discussion on those resources of some type that we can post later on the XR Denver page. Yeah,
I support both calling it right now and with what we just suggested as a possible future Q&A. Yeah, and I also just wanted to express like gratitude to people who like are watching this right now as we're doing this live, or who will watch the recording later. Like typically at the end of our Heading for Extinction and What to Do About It talks, we have a slide that's like, thank you for caring. And that's how I feel right now. Thank you for caring. And then to the folks who put stuff on the live stream comment section, like, thank you for that, because I mean, it's not only great to see that people are engaging with this, but like, if we do go back and refine this training, we'll take what you guys have put out, or what y'all have put out, and bring it back into the training to make it better. So gratitude to everyone.
Yeah, thanks for engaging and learning. Really glad to have everyone today.
All right. Are we gonna hop off Facebook Live?
I think you can just stop it. I was trying to think if the recording, if I need to do anything. I think it just like saved off okay. So I think we ended it. Thanks everybody.
It still says it's live. I'm not sure.
It's live. Oh, I'm so okay with them having like 5 minutes of us just cracking up and watching Dave try and do tech wizard things though.
I don't know what it's from. I think it's from like a sitcom or something, but a few years ago, some of my friends, they just like could not stop saying like, fuck it, we'll do it live. And like this whole time, that's all I've been thinking about.
I'm hitting the button. Goodbye.
Bye.